Today's lecture is going to be on the Cold War, which roughly starts around 1945, the end of World War II, basically, and ends in the late 80s, early 90s. There's not really an exact end to it, but around 91, it's basically over. So, of course, it's called the Cold War, which is kind of an odd thing to call it, but of course, what that means is it's not a hot war. A hot war means you're firing guns, you're exploding bombs, you're actually fighting a war. The Cold War is more like a game of chess, where if you play chess, part of the game of chess is somebody moves their man one way, so you move your man another way. You constantly try to check the other side. So, in other words, if Russia builds 50 bombs, we're going to build 100 bombs. And the idea is you intimidate your enemy to the point that they never fight the war, they just give up. So fortunately for all of us, the Cold War never became a full-on hot war, or else most of us wouldn't be here today. Although, as we'll see later, there were lots of wars during the Cold War, lots of little wars, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, war in Afghanistan. Actually, about 20 million people died in the Cold War. But luckily, the main players, China, US, Russia, never went to war with each other. And to kind of reemphasize the fear of the Cold War, which is something I think nowadays is hard for us to identify with, because the Cold War has been done for almost 30 years, is to look at this image. This image, you got what looks like a father and a mom and a child. And they're sitting in this kind of weird metal container with beds, and you can see the boxes say canned food, and you see some gas masks and other stuff. This is, of course, a bomb shelter, which is something that was sold to families in the U.S. in the 40s and 50s and 60s. In fact, even around Southwest Georgia, today there are still a few bomb shelters. I know there's one in Thomasville, and I had a student a couple of years ago whose family still had a bomb shelter. By the way, these things would not have protected you at all if a nuclear war ever actually happened. But the idea is nuclear war happens, the Russians attack us with bombs, you hide out in here until the war is over with, and then you come out and, you repopulate the earth. And that was a reality. A lot of people thought that, this was going to happen, that the nuclear holocaust would be real. So this kind of puts you in the frame of mind of the Cold War a little bit. So, the battle lines of the Cold War. This is, even though the Cold War involves the entire world, overwhelmingly, it really was about Europe, which is where World War I happened, and of course, World War II comes out of World War I. And so, if you think about the World War II lecture, we talked about how the Nazis, the Nazi Germans controlled all of Europe, and the Russians pushed the Nazis back to Germany from the east, and we pushed the Nazis after D-Day from the West. And the Russians and the Americans met in Berlin. And what I didn't say during that lecture is that basically became the beginning of the Cold War. Because as Russia retook Eastern Europe from the Nazis, they didn't free Eastern Europe. They basically said, oh, well, the Nazis controlled Eastern Europe. We've kicked the Nazis out. Now we're in control. So in a way, we beat one enemy and in the process created another enemy. So the areas that we liberated, those actually stayed free. The areas that the Russians liberated, those became part of the Soviet Empire. So these are the battle lines of the Cold War, East versus West. Communism versus everybody else. I don't expect you to remember all these leaders, but just so you have some sense, it's mostly US and Russia. Later, it will also be China. But these are your main leaders of these two countries. So we start with Harry Truman, who was president at the end of World War II. He'll be reelected until the early 1950s. And you get a general from World War II, Dwight D. Eisenhower, or Ike Eisenhower. He will be president until the early 60s. And then John F. Kennedy will be president. He'll be followed by Lyndon Johnson, then Richard Nixon, then Jimmy Carter, then Ronald Reagan. In Russia, It starts out with Joseph Stalin, who was the leader of Russia from the 1920s until the 1950s, nearly 30 years. And then he'll be followed by Nikita Khrushchev. So they're the main Russian leaders during most of this, but we also have Leonid Brezhnev, a guy named Andropov, and then a guy that we're going to talk about, Mikhail Gorbachev. But these are your main leaders for now. So I don't expect you to remember them, but when I say these names, hopefully you'll kind of recognize them. Again, I always want to go back to movies and popular culture. And we didn't make that many Cold War movies or TV shows back then because it really was so serious. It wasn't something you made fun shows about. In the same way, we didn't make movies about 9/11 for quite a while after 9/11. That was really like too serious to make movies about. But we can still look at movies to get a sense of the fears. And sometimes the more interesting films are the horror films and the science fiction films. And it is interesting when you look at all these crazy movies from the 50s. Movies like Tarantula or The Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, The Incredible Shrinking Man, Godzilla, King of Monsters. If you look at what's at the heart of all of these, it's nuclear bombs, radiation, the fear of attack by aliens. You know, when you hear attack by aliens, what that really means is attack by communists. The fact that the aliens in a lot of these old movies were basically communists. But also the fear of the bomb itself, the fear of world destruction. Again, I think it's hard for us today to identify with that same fear. But the fear was very real. You know, most Americans in the 40s and 50s assumed that a nuclear war would indeed happen. Not that it could happen, that it would happen within 20, 30 years. I mean, a lot of people thought, you know, we were kind of the last generation. The images you see here are kids doing something called duck and cover. In fact, if you want to pause this video for a moment, I have a link on Georgia View to a training film for kids called Duck and Cover. It's really quite funny because, of course, this wouldn't protect you against anything. But, you know, this is supposed to make people feel better, that you would train how to hide under your desk in case the Russians ever attacked and you would survive. But it just goes to show, again, the level of fear that people really did have at this time, that there really was a sense that nuclear war could happen at any moment. Even when I was a kid in the 70s and 80s, you know, towards the end of the Cold War, there really was a sense that, any moment we might wake up to find that bombs are dropping and we're all dying. I mean, nowadays we fear terrorism, disease. There's a lot of people that think the government's trying to take us over. It's almost like we're looking for stuff to be afraid of nowadays. When, you know, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, even 70s, nuclear war was a genuine thing that could happen. And in fact, it almost happened a couple of times. So, like I said, I don't think most of us fear that the war is about to come to an end, but there was a sense back then that it could. Again, we talked a little bit about the dropping of 2 atomic bombs. Which, by the way, atomic bombs, nuclear bombs, same thing. Nuclear bombs, usually that word is used to describe bigger bombs, but they mean the same thing, by the way. But the 2 atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan, this is another image of Hiroshima after the dropping of the bomb. It really does change attitudes overnight. You know, part of our dropping the bomb in Japan was, of course, about ending the war. But there was also a bit there about taking revenge. You know, Americans were so mad at Japan for Pearl Harbor. In fact, when Harry Truman was debating about dropping the bomb on Japan, they had a whole debate about whether they should do it or not. One person said to Truman, "Hey, should we warn them that it's coming?" And his response was, "They didn't warn us about Pearl Harbor. Why should we warn them about this?" But of course, after we dropped the 2 bombs, they were much bigger than anybody realized. And the amount of damage and death far surpassed what anybody thought would happen. That once we did this and Japan surrendered, there was a sense of, okay, Japan has paid the price. Almost overnight, we really do change our attitude towards Japan. We feel like, okay, we have paid the price. There's also another attitude that changed, and that is a realization immediately by everybody that forever war will always be different. The stakes are so much higher now than they were before. And there is a sense that we really do have to do everything we can to prevent a future major war. If you remember the 20s and 30s, America didn't care about the rest of the world, which is what partly allowed World War II to happen. After World War II, because of atomic bombs, there is a sense that we really can't allow this to happen again. It's interesting, we talked a little bit about how much America feared and even hated Japan, and vice versa, by the way. U.S. Marines did most of the fighting in the Pacific. The U.S. Army was the major fighters in Europe. Marines were the major fighters in the Pacific. Here is a U.S. Marine magazine, Leatherneck magazine. This is September 1945. Not even a full month since the bomb was dropped on Japan. And you have an image of a U.S. Marine snuggling up to a little Japanese person portrayed here as a monkey. If you remember the propaganda, the Japanese were portrayed as giant apes. Here, just a little harmless monkey. And the image is clear. This magazine of the Marines is saying, hey, okay, war is over with. We have to be friends with the Japanese. And again, that's so odd, how much we hated the Japanese during the war. But there's two reasons for this. One is the bomb. There is a sense, okay, they've paid the price. But the second part of this is the Cold War. By the end of World War II, the American government realized that as we're ending one war, we're already beginning another. Because there was a realization that Russia, our ally during the war, will now be our enemy. That they are beginning to take over Europe. They want to take over all of Europe, in fact. And they are getting ready to take over Japan. They were already getting ready to go to Japan. So we realized that unless we want Japan to be part of Russia, we need to be friends with Japan very, very quickly. So there is a propaganda campaign to get Americans to no longer hate the Japanese and to say, okay, hey guys, they're our friends now. Again, which is so weird when you think about what we just saw in World War II. But again, there's also a realization that we as the United States need to change. There was a realization that before World War II, we really were kind of going in the wrong direction when it came to race. Because again, after World War II, we will start to see the civil rights movement begin. So there is a realization that we need to change racial attitudes and a lot of other attitudes. And one of those was our attitudes towards not just Japan, an acceptance of Japan, but also an acceptance of immigrants, that diversity may not be a bad thing. So we accept Japan as a culture, as a country. Why? Again, some people may not like the word guilt, but still somewhat guilt over the bombs, a sense of, okay, they've paid the price. But again, a fear of communist Russia, a fear that if we don't befriend Japan, Russia will. And we don't want Japan to be part of communist Russia. An example of this is 1952. All Asians can become citizens. There was naturalized citizens. Since 1890s, if an Asian was born in the U.S., they were a U.S. citizen. But if an Asian just came to the U.S., they weren't allowed to become citizens. Whether you're from Japan or China or Korea or Vietnam or the Philippines, at least until the Philippines became part of the U.S., you could never become a citizen. You always would remain a legal alien. 1952, that changes. There's like, okay. In other words, as you can see, there's kind of this racial divide. We don't want those people being part of us. That changes by 1952. 1956, they got rid of what they call alien land laws. If you were an Asian, you were not allowed to own land in America unless you were born here. 1956, they get rid of those laws. So these are just examples of how our attitudes change, not just towards Japan, but towards Asia as a whole. Another example of our attempts to befriend Japan was this image here. This is General Douglas MacArthur on the left. He was in charge of the Philippines during the war. He's the guy who surrendered the 80,000 soldiers and then left. And then a couple of years later came back and retook the Philippines from the Japanese. He is now the supreme commander of Japan. In reality, he was basically the dictator of Japan, a very nice dictator. I mean, he really rebuilt Japan for the Americas and then eventually left. Here is Douglas MacArthur standing next to the Emperor of Japan, Emperor Hirohito, a person that Japanese people hardly ever saw, never heard the voice of. He was literally considered a god to many Japanese people. So here's an image of Hirohito. It's just a regular person. As you can see, MacArthur's much taller than Hirohito, and that was kind of on purpose. They could have made it look like they were the same size. This is propaganda in a lot of ways. Number one, it's propaganda in that it shows that MacArthur and Hirohito could stand in the same room together and not kill each other, that they are friends now, that they are allies. But there's also a sense of knocking down Hirohito, that he's just a guy. And in fact, the fact that Douglas MacArthur doesn't even wear a tie in this image, he doesn't have any of his medals on. He's standing very casually while Hirohito is dressed up like to the nines, shows that Hirohito is in a way subservient to MacArthur, that Hirohito has to impress MacArthur. MacArthur doesn't have to impress Hirohito. So on one hand, this is like a friendly propaganda, but there's also a sense of saying, the Japan that you knew with Emperor Hirohito as the supreme leader, that Japan is gone now. And Japan needs to rebuild. On the other side, in the European side, at the end of World War II, here is a classic image of American soldiers shaking hands with Russian soldiers in Germany. And, there were stories that they danced together and they drank chocolate, and drank beer and vodka together, and they were having a wonderful time, that these two allies finally defeat the enemy. But it's also very sad because in reality, the Russians and Americans were really already at war with each other. They just didn't know it yet. So it's kind of a sad image if you stop and think about it from that way. Because not only was Germany divided between the West, France, England, America, and the East, Russia. I mean, they basically split Germany right down the middle. East Germany, West Germany. But even the capital of Germany, Berlin, was also split right down the middle. On one half, you had Russians, the communists. The other half, you had the West, the non-communists. And even though it was divided between France, Britain, and America, it really was the U.S. that controlled Western Berlin. And in a way, Germany, and especially the city of Berlin, becomes the symbol of the Cold War. And as you'll see, we'll keep kind of going back to Berlin, back to Germany. And the symbolic end of the Cold War is the reunification of Berlin and Germany. Because as you know, today, it's just Germany. It's just Berlin. There is no East and West Germany anymore. Before we go too much further, and I don't want to spend much time on this because we could do a whole lecture just on this, but I wanted to talk a little bit about communism in general. I think a lot of people today really don't know much about communism. And we throw the term around a lot, but very few people really are communist today. There's only 5 communist countries today. There's China, which in a way really isn't communist anymore. They're kind of their own thing, but there's China. There's Cuba, which I don't think will be communist much longer. There's North Korea. There's Vietnam, and there's Laos. That's it. That's the only communist countries we have today. And really none of them are truly communist in the real sense. So let's talk about what is the idea of communism? What is this, and why does America fear it? Communism is a philosophy that a guy named Karl Marx came up with. That's him. That's his grave you see in that image. Karl Marx was German. He was a historian, and that's all he was just a historian who used history as a way to try to predict the future, which historians should never do that, but that's what he was trying to do. He lived most of his life in London, England, and that's where he's died. In fact, that's where he's buried in London at Highgate Cemetery, and people today still go visit his grave. It's funny, a lot of people consider Karl Marx to be very cruel and terrible. He was really a nice guy who was just trying to come up with an idea of how to make the world better. When Karl Marx was alive, it was the Industrial Revolution, just like it was here in the US, and you had a lot of poor people, I mean, really poor people living throughout Europe, working for pennies a day in very, very unsafe conditions. And they were usually working in very dangerous factories run by very rich factory owners, or they were poor farmers working on these huge estates owned by fairly uncaring landowners. And of course, these countries were ruled by kings and politicians who clearly didn't care for most people. So in other words, you had a situation where you had a few really, really rich people. He called them the bourgeoisie. That was his name for them. And you had a lot of really poor working people. He called them the proletariat. And he argued, he said, look, if things don't get better, eventually the proletariat will rise up against the bourgeoisie. It's going to happen. And he says, there's going to be a very terrible war. So here's what you could do. Why don't we create a situation where everybody owns everything? We'll live like a commune. There'll be no poverty. There'll be no need for government. We can all just live as one. We can just live peacefully with each other, and we'll all feed each other. It'll be great. It's a neat idea. It's a beautiful idea. It's not realistic, and it didn't work, but that's the idea. How does that come about? He never really says exactly. He says at some point there will be a revolution. The proletariat will rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie. And we should encourage that. And we should, again, help create this communist nation. Now, again, he never says exactly how that should happen, but he did say that it should only happen in developed nations. In fact, he thought it would happen in the U.S. He liked the U.S. He said the U.S. is already part communist anyway. We're a democracy. We choose our own leaders. We say that all men are created equal. He said, that's great. You're already partly there. You just need to keep going. But he's also said that it only works if everybody's communist. In other words, it should be international. So the job of a communist is try to get everybody else to be a communist. That's partly the scary part. Because, like, for instance, Russia, who is the first country to become communist. Russia becomes communist in 1917, which, by the way, they were not a developed nation. They were the last country that Marx thought should be communist. But nonetheless, they were the first country to go communist. And so that's why Russia wants to take over the world, because they're going by Marx. They said, okay, Marx said that everybody has to be communist for it to work, so hence Russia wants to take over the world. By the way, Marx would have hated Russia. And the way Russia behaves is completely different from how Marx thought it should happen. That you shouldn't force communism on everybody, that people should choose to be communists on their own. But again, his long-term goals is no politics, no rich people, all that. He did admit that there may be a need for a dictator for a very short period, But nonetheless, so Marx was just kind of a dreamer. He had this crazy idea. He was very unrealistic. And again, he never actually did any of this. It was just, it was 40 years after he died before anybody started doing this stuff. And the reality is we've never had a truly communist country in any way or sense. What Russia really was a dictatorship that was kind of socialist. And socialist is a similar idea, but socialist means the government runs all the businesses, while in communism, the people own everything. So Russia and in China, it's really the government that runs everything, which is really more socialist than communist. I know we're getting a little picky here. But again, the idea that it should spread to everybody else, that's going to be the part that America is going to try to prevent. So when does the Cold War begin? It really is hard to say, okay, this is the day it begins. But we could say it begins in the summer of 1945 at the Potsdam Conference, which was in Germany. By this point, Eastern Germany was controlled by Russia. by that guy on the right, the guy in the white jacket and the mustache. That's Joseph Stalin. He's a guy who took over Russia in 1924, and he was a dictator. He was a really horrendous leader. He would end up killing 20 million of his own people as a very cruel communist dictator, forcing communism on everybody. And you know, I can't overemphasize how cruel Russia was to its own people under Stalin. And the U.S. really didn't have a lot of knowledge of that at the time. We come to learn this. At the moment, again, Russia was still an ally of ours, Uncle Joe, as he was referred to in the press. So in the middle, we got Harry Truman, the president of the United States, and on the other side, we have Winston Churchill, the leader of England, who, by the way, gets voted out of office during this conference. He actually has to leave because he gets voted out. But here they are, all shaking hands, smiling. But by this point, we're really no longer allies. Again, this conference was held in Russian territory. Stalin had microphones placed in all the bedrooms of the other guys so he could spy on them. During this conference, the United States successfully tested our first nuclear bomb, called the Trinity test. Truman got a telegram saying the test was successful. At this point, we are still at war with Japan. And Stalin was getting ready to help us with Japan. We didn't want them to help us by this point. But Stalin was like, hey, I'm going to come help you guys. And Truman said to Stalin, we just developed a new weapon that we think is going to end the war. And that's all Truman said. He didn't tell Stalin about the atomic bomb. He told Churchill about it, but he didn't tell Stalin about it. Stalin already knew about it. In fact, Stalin knew about the bomb before Truman did, because Stalin had spies in Los Alamos where the bomb was built. So Stalin is spying on Truman. Truman is not telling Stalin about the bomb. Stalin notices that Truman isn't telling him about the bomb. So these are not the actions of friends. These are the actions of enemies. Not only that, but Stalin also knew that Truman told Churchill about it. You know, so they're smiling, shaking hands. They're acting like enemies already, even though the public didn't know this yet. A second act of the Cold War was the bomb that we dropped on Japan. This weird image you see is from a movie called Dr. Strangelove. Great film if you ever get a chance to see it, which is a dark comedy about nuclear war. Teddy Roosevelt once said that a man should talk softly, but carry a big stick. In other words, don't start fights, but be prepared for a fight if one starts, you know. The United States, with the bomb, has the big stick, if you will. You know, we're the only country with the bomb. No other country has it. And so part of the reason we dropped the bomb on Japan was revenge. Part of it was to end the war. But another major part of it was to scare Russia. Again, Russia had already taken over Eastern Europe, and Russia was eyeing Japan, and we knew that. So by dropping the bomb on Japan, we were kind of saying, hey, Russia, don't get any big ideas because we got the bomb. You don't, we got it. You know, so that was also a little bit of a brushback, a pushback to Russia. So I think sometimes we forget that's part of the reason we did drop the bomb, was to alert Russia. And it did. It scared Russia. They thought, oh, my God, what is that? We don't have one of those. But it's really 1946 that the Cold War becomes obvious. In February 1946, Stalin gives a speech. It was a secret speech, but we learned about it very quickly. Stalin gave a speech to the Communist Party members, you know, his fellow leaders. And in that speech, he very clearly said, capitalism, meaning the U.S., capitalism and communism are not compatible, and communism will prevail. I know it seems kind of lame today, but what he's really saying is communism will win. And he's really kind of declaring war. You know, he's basically saying the U.S. cannot exist as it does today. That, Russia and the U.S. cannot coexist. Only one can exist, and it will be Russia. I mean, he is basically telling his government, we will do everything in our power to knock down the U.S. and take it down. So in a way, he's declaring war. A month later, Winston Churchill, who's at this point is not Prime Minister of England, he will go back to being Prime Minister. He'll get reelected at some point. But he's still a huge national leader. It's kind of like Bill Clinton today. He's not president, but he goes all over the world and gives speeches. Winston Churchill gives a speech here in the U.S. And here he is giving the speech. He's at the University of Missouri. Missouri is Harry Truman, President Truman's home state. In fact, Harry Truman is there. You can't see him here, but he's sitting behind Winston Churchill. In fact, if you look on the podium, it says President of the United States. So Harry Truman had just given a speech, and then he turns it over to Winston Churchill. And everybody loved Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was half American anyway. His mother was American. So he loved the U.S., and the Americans loved him. And they listened to him. And during the speech, it's kind of an answer to Stalin. He basically talks about what Stalin said. And he then gives a speech. And part of it is, he says, from all the major cities of Eastern Europe, and he goes through and he names them all. He says, they are now in what I call the Soviet sphere. They're under Soviet influence. So he's the first leader to say, hey, Russia just took over Eastern Europe. I mean, we knew it, but it wasn't something we talked about. So he's blatantly saying, hey, Russia is no longer an ally. We need to think of Russia as an enemy. And he said, if you go to Eastern Europe, he said, you don't hear any news from Eastern Europe. They don't know what's going on with us. We don't know what's going on with them. He said, it is like an iron curtain has been drawn. Now, some people hear that and they think there actually was this big giant wall. And there wasn't. It's just a symbol. It's an analogy. There was a wall in Berlin that separated East and West Berlin, but it was only 35 miles long. So some people get the Berlin Wall mixed up with the Iron Curtain. Iron Curtain was just an idea, an image that Churchill came up with to describe what was going on in Eastern Europe. Because it was true, when Russia took over Eastern Europe, they controlled all speech, they controlled all government, they controlled all news. So people in places like Poland, they didn't know what was going on in the West. They didn't know what was going on in the U.S. They only knew what the Russians allowed them to know. So again, it's like a big metal curtain was drawn around Eastern Europe, which is, again, the opposite of the West, where we believe in freedom and freedom of speech and freedom of the press and speaking your mind and democracy. This is exactly the opposite of that. And Churchill was the first one to point that out. And so with these two speeches of Stalin saying, the West and the East are not compatible, and Churchill talking about Iron Curtain, between these two events in February, March of 46, this is when the public becomes aware of the reality of the situation. So Americans are starting to realize that we just came out of a horrible war, but we might be going to an even more dangerous war than the one we just left. By the way, if you want to hear a little bit of the speech, I'll have a link on Georgia View. If you just want to hear him give the speech and hear what his voice sounded like. So again, by spring of 1946, Americans have gone from feeling very secure and happy at the end of World War II to being very, very afraid. And again, I think today it's hard to imagine how afraid they really were. Because looking back, that time period seems really easygoing. The 40s and 50s seemed like a really nice period and things were great. There used to be a show called Happy Days that was about this period. But at the time, it was actually very, very scary. As I said earlier, most Americans assumed there would be a nuclear war. So there was a poll done, and it turned out that 3/4 of Americans truly feared Russia by 1946. We liked Russia until 46. 3/4 of Americans were afraid of Russia. Not only that, but over half Americans thought we were being too soft on Russia. Excuse me, that we need to be doing more. And again, think about how much of a contrast this was to just 10 years earlier, 1930s, Americans didn't want to have anything to do with Russia or Germany or Europe. Here we are after World War II, and we are no longer isolationists. We are like, we need to do more, not less. We need to do more than we're doing. So again, we see this huge attitudinal change after World War II, because there is this realization, partly because of the bomb, that if we don't do something, things might get very, very dangerous. Another big event happens in the summer of 1946. In July, we explode a couple of bombs in the Marshall Islands, which is, again, a series of islands that we've owned since 1800. That's part of our little empire out in the Pacific. But part of that is the Bikini Atoll. It's this little series of islands within the Marshall Islands. We exploded a bigger atomic bomb. In fact, we actually exploded 2 bombs. And again, by the way, I do have a video on Georgia View, a link to a video that you can. So if you want to pause it and watch the explosions, you can. What's really weird about atomic bombs? They're very scary, but they're also quite beautiful in their own weird way. They're almost hypnotic, and they're quite amazing. They actually exploded 2 bombs. One was on July 1st, 1946, and it was a bomb exploded from the air, about 250 miles in the air. They dropped it and it exploded. And that was referred to as Able bomb. And then 3 weeks later, on July 25th, they exploded a bomb. And this is the one you always see in the images. They exploded a bomb from the water, about 90 feet under the water, and it was called Baker bomb. In other words, A bomb, B bomb, Able and Baker. Both of these bombs each were 23 kilotons. They were much larger than the bombs over Japan. It's kind of weird to think about this, but these were only the 4th and 5th ever explosions of a nuclear bomb. The first explosion was Trinity test, summer of 45. That was the one Truman was told about. And then we did 2 in Japan. So now here are 2 more. And by the way, you can see these ships in the water. Those are surplus Navy ships that were used to give you a sense of scale. There were 242 ships involved in this, 156 planes. There were 25,000 monitors keeping track of this. There were 42,000 men involved in this, and over 5,000 rats, pigs, and goats that were kept on these islands. To some degree, this was an experiment. They were kind of seeing, okay, hey, how big can these be? How much damage can they cause? They're also checking radiation. So that's why the animals were there. They explode them and then check on the animals later to see how much radiation they have, how hard were they burned, which ones survived, how close could you be to the bomb and survive. But notice I have the phrase "shot heard round the world." That's a phrase you hear about a lot of things. The beginning of the American Revolution, that's been used for. When the guy killed Franz Ferdinand to start World War I, that phrase was used. But this is truly a shot heard around the world. Because unlike the first test back in 45, when it was totally secret, this was public. This was completely public. We invited the world press in to see this. Television, radio, movie film, everybody, Russians, Japanese, Chinese, everybody was here. We were not just testing the bombs. We were also reminding the world that we have the bomb. Again, remember, in 46, nobody else has the bomb. This is it. So we're telling everybody, especially Russia, don't get any ideas. If you invade a country, we will bomb you. And you can't invade us because we got the bomb. We have the big stick. So to a large degree, that's what this test was about. It wasn't just a test. It was part of the Cold War. And this is just an image of some of the surplus Navy ships that were used in this test. So these are some of the ships that we didn't need anymore that were exploded during this. It's funny when people hear the term bikini, this is what people think of, the actual bikini, a bathing suit. Well, the bikini was invented in the summer of 46. In fact, on July 5th, in Paris, before even before the second bomb was exploded, a Paris fashion designer named I should say it French-wise, Louis Rier, was the one who came up with the bikini, but he didn't know what to call it. Here he is with his original model, an Italian woman named Micheline Bernardini. She was the first person to wear the bikini. He said, this will be like an explosion on the beaches of the world. It will be like what happened at the Bikini Atoll. So hence it started becoming known as the bikini. By the way, I'm going to show you an image in a second. Don't think too badly of me. I'm just going to do it for a second. So if you want to see it more, you have to hit pause. But it's funny, we think of our grandparents and great-grandparents as being really boring. Every generation thinks they're the wild generation. They cuss and drink and have sex and do crazy stuff. And your parents and your grandparents were really, really boring. And of course, your parents and grandparents probably act really boring. They don't tell you about all the crazy stuff they did. But of course, the reality is every generation is about the same. You know, your parents were crazy. Your grandparents were crazy at one time. And an example of this is the bikini. I mean, the bikini was a lot skimpier than you think it is, because you see this image and you think, oh, that's not that skimpy, until you see it from behind and you realize how. So the next image is what the bikini originally looked like from behind. So there you go. There you go. That's what the original bikini looked like. So bikini is part of the Cold War, oddly enough. And it is funny, even today, we still sometimes use, we talk about things being the bomb, or we talk about women, a bombshell, you know, she's beautiful, she's a bombshell, she's, he's going to go nuclear on that person. We still use a lot of Cold War terminology. It's funny. Okay. So as you can see, 1946, things are getting tense. There's no war, there's no fighting. Mostly people are just trying to get over World War II, but there's clearly ratcheting up of tensions between the U.S., because we are the leaders of the world at this point. I mean, all of our allies, Japan now, France, England, Western Germany, I mean, they're destroyed. They don't have any money. They're in depression. We're it. And our enemy is Russia. They're the other country doing really good right now. Everybody else is doing terrible. So now we're in the summer of 1947. We get something known as the Truman Doctrine. Of course, Truman, president of the United States after World War II, whenever a president does stuff, a certain way of doing things, we sometimes refer to that as a doctrine. There was a Bush doctrine, and his doctrine was basically to fight terrorism wherever it is. So that was his doctrine. We're going to fight terrorism, even if it's not in the U.S. There's an Obama doctrine. I mean, his is basically diplomacy. He's big on diplomacy, and we've seen that during his. Truman came up with his own doctrine, and to some degree, this was the idea of fighting communism by being friends with everybody who is not communism. In other words, there's a reason why people turn communist. When things are going really badly and there's no hope, communism is an alternative, and it turns out to be a bad alternative, but it is an alternative. And so Truman says, we as a nation have to make sure that countries of the world do not turn to communism as an alternative. So again, in 46, 47, most of Europe was doing pretty badly. They needed money, they needed help. But Turkey and Greece, which is in Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, they weren't under Russian control, but they were doing pretty badly. I mean, really bad. To the point that they were beginning to look towards communism as kind of an answer. In fact, Turkey actually will become communist, but they will be separate from Russia. They'll kind of be their own communists. So there's a real crisis. And Russia's ready to go into Turkey and Greece. In fact, they got armies ready to go. And the only reason Russia doesn't invade Turkey and Greece, only reason, is because we got the bomb. That's the only reason. And Truman has told them, if you invade them, we will bomb you. But what if Greece and Turkey just chooses to be communist and join with Russia? We can't really do much about that. So what Truman says we have to do is we have to help them out. We got to give them money to do this. So he asked for, in March, he asked for Congress to give $400 million to Turkey and Greece. And we need to pay them by June 30th, because otherwise they're going to turn to Russia. And he gives a speech when he does this. He gives this huge national speech. And again, if you want to listen to it, I'll have a video on Georgia View if you just want to listen to a little bit of it. But during that speech, he said something really interesting and something that no president had really said up to that point. Part of the speech, he says, "The free people of the world look to us for support in keeping their freedoms. If we falter, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger our nation." So not only is he saying, hey, we, the United States, might be in trouble if we don't help our fellow nations out, but we will see another war. But that use of the term freedom, democracy, freedom versus tyranny. Again, before World War II, presidents didn't talk about that. When we talked about imperialism, one thing that President Roosevelt, President Taft, President Wilson, the one thing they did not talk about was spreading democracy, spreading freedom to other peoples. That's what Truman's talking about. We got to help other people be free and be democratic. And we have to do this. This is a real change in the way presidents talk about the world. And we still talk this way today. This is a big deal. It was very controversial. A lot of people didn't want to do this, but most Americans agreed that it was in our best interest to indeed do this. After the Truman Doctrine was approved, there was another plan. It's also part of the Truman Doctrine, but it's known today as the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, again, was under Truman, but it was developed by the guy you see here. His name was George Marshall. During World War II, he was the guy in charge of all the military, not just in Europe, but also in Japan. He was the guy that all the generals answered to, and he served just under Franklin Roosevelt, the president. Well, under Truman, he is now Secretary of State. And so because of the Truman Doctrine, he says, okay, if that's true, if we really want to do this stuff, we can't just help Turkey and Greece. We also have to help, if you will, everybody else. It can't just be Turkey and Greece because everybody else is in trouble. And, we got to help them out. So this was basically a plan to rebuild Europe. What we didn't do in World War I, we need to do this time because Europe is destroyed. All of Europe is destroyed. And Congress reluctantly agreed to this. And as you can see, $13 billion were spent. Today, that would be, we're talking maybe $500 billion in today's dollars. But back then it was $13 billion. Over the next 4 or 5 years to rebuild Europe. By the way, we offered money to Russia, by the way, and to their satellite countries. But they rejected it because they knew that there were conditions to this money. Some of that condition is to get rid of communism. So, But part of the goal was to contain communism. And I'll come back to that idea in just a moment. But we didn't want communism spreading to these other countries. It was like, okay, if we help these countries out, we give them some money and food, and we help rebuild, they won't feel a need to turn to communism. They'll stay on our side. But there's also another benefit to that. If they stay on our side, that also means that they will be buying our stuff. So this is going to help the U.S. in a big way because we have all these factories and all this stuff. We're kind of creating customers. It's kind of like the New Deal. Part of the New Deal was to get American people back to work and money in their hands so they can buy stuff. This is kind of the New Deal for the world. We're really kind of doing the same thing. We're priming the pump. We're giving everybody money so they can start buying stuff. And of course, they're going to buy it from us because we're the one with all the factories. So this actually ended up benefiting us in a big way as well. But it worked, by the way. We don't see Western Europe or even Japan turning to communism. And there was an attempt to do that at one point. They were thinking about it. So with the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan and the Bikini Test, we're fully committed to this war, this Cold War. We're spending lots and lots of money on this. And it seemed to be going pretty good. 45, 46, 47, 48. We're the big power. We're the only ones with nuclear bombs. And we're containing communism. But then China, and I have quotes here, falls to communism. And that's not really what happened, but we used to think of communism almost like a disease. And if you're not careful, you catch this disease of communism. And that's what we said happened to China. They fell to communism. That's not really what happened. Actually, China had tried to become a communist nation way back in the 1920s, and it failed. In the 1930s, they tried again. There was a huge war, a civil war. Mao Zedong was the communist leader, and Chiang Kai-shek was the nationalist leader. And throughout the 1930s, China had a civil war, the nationalists versus the communists. They only stopped fighting when Japan invaded. So they joined forces to fight Japan. But now that war is over with, World War II is done, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong are back fighting each other again. Well, in 1949, Mao Zedong wins. The communists wins. Chiang Kai-shek and his leaders, they leave. And China becomes, by October 1949, China is known as the People's Republic of China. Again, the idea that the people own China. Really, they weren't. They were a socialist dictatorship led by Mao Zedong, who also was a very cruel leader and killed millions of his own people. But they were called the People's Republic of China. And in November 1949, China and Russia joined forces. They became allies. Now, by the way, 10 years later, they will be enemies. But for about 10 years, China and Russia are buddies. China, by the way, was almost 1 billion people back then. They had the largest population in the world. And Russia had the largest army in the world. They weren't the most powerful army, but they had the largest army in the world. And between these two countries, they're almost unstoppable. In fact, if China and Russia decided to invade the U.S., there's not a whole lot we could have done to prevent it. I mean, they would have tens of millions of soldiers they could have invaded us with. The only thing we had helping us was we were the only country with a bomb. But that will change in 1949 as well. Because in 1949, Russia explodes their first nuclear bomb. This is a photo of their first bomb. What's interesting about Russia, Russia was very, very backward as a nation. Up until World War II, Russia had very little technology, even during World War II. I mean, some of their soldiers were fighting on horses. They were not the technological leaders like we were. It took us a long time to develop the bomb, and we had some of the world's best scientists working on it. And yet here it is, just a couple of years later, Russia has the bomb. And so the question is, how do they do it? But before I even get to that part, think about it. We are no longer the only country with a bomb. Again, Russia has the bomb now. Things are completely different. So 1949 is a very scary year. At first, it seemed like we were doing okay. Now, we're not. And from 49 until the mid-1950s, the United States goes into a panic, a genuine panic. And we'll talk about that in a moment. I mean, they really, really panic all the way. Again, China's now communist, and now Russia has a bomb, which means that Russia eventually is going to start putting bombs throughout Eastern Europe aimed at us. By the way, China will get a bomb within 10 years. England eventually gets their own bomb. France gets their own bomb. And that's all that's going to have the bomb for a long time. Even today, less than 10 countries have the bomb. Today, it's China, Russia, England, France, US, Pakistan, India, maybe Israel, and maybe North Korea. And that's it. That's all who have the bomb today. So, but at this point, the nuclear club was now 2, US and Russia. So how did they do it? They did it the old-fashioned way. They stole it. Because again, Stalin had spies at Los Alamos in New Mexico, where we developed the bomb. One of those spies was a guy named Klaus Fuchs. He was a German who was pro-communist, so he liked Russia. He had migrated to England to be a spy. And then from England, he went to Los Alamos to work on the bomb, and he began to send secrets to the Russians. He is how He is how Stalin knew about the bomb at Potsdam Conference. This is the guy who told them. So he was one of the guys stealing stuff. We because of the Russia exploding the bomb, we very quickly started trying to say, okay, who's obviously a spy? Who's the spy? And he was caught and sentenced to prison. But because he was from England, they're the ones who tried him. And England tends to be more lenient than we are in criminals. So he was sentenced to 9 years in prison. And in 1959, he was released. Here he is being released. That's him with his son. He was sent to East Germany. And he would live until 1988. He would spend the rest of his life building rockets and bombs for the Russians in Eastern Germany to eventually be used against us. So he's one of the reasons that they get the bomb. But he was not the only spy. And again, the United States starts to go after spies and communists. And this is when the panic kicks in, 49, 50, 51, 52. We, the American public, and the government starts to look for spies everywhere. The Rosenbergs, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Boy, aren't those old-fashioned names? You never meet any Ethels anymore. Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, a married couple. He had also worked at Los Alamos and continued to work with the atomic bomb program. And Julius Rosenberg was indeed a spy. Now, they were both convicted of this. There's always been some rumor that Ethel Rosenberg may not have been part of this. In fact, this is the summer of 2015, and just a couple of weeks ago, there was a story that came out that there seems to be proof that Ethel Rosenberg didn't really have much to do with this, but people said she did. So the way it worked was Rosenberg was the scientist. He knew all these secrets, and she would type up the secrets for him, and then they would send them to Russian spies and eventually over to Russia. So Rosenbergs were another way that the Russians got the nuclear bomb. Well, they were caught. And we know for a fact that Julius Rosenberg definitely did this. They were caught and they were executed. Quite different from what England did to Klaus Fuchs. And she is one of the few women to ever be executed. And it was highly, highly controversial, even at the time, that she was executed. And for years, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was very common. Like if I was teaching this in 1985, there's a very good chance that I would have said, these guys didn't do it. They were totally innocent. That yes, they were perhaps communists in their philosophy. Because by the way, we are a free country. You're allowed to be a communist. As long as you don't start a revolution, you're allowed to be whatever you want to be. They were also Jewish, so some people thought there was some anti-Semitism here as well. And that was kind of the standard story, is that these guys were innocent and that they were just unfairly convicted. And there were people unfairly convicted during this time. Actually, thousands of people were sent to jail. They shouldn't have been sent to jail. But since the 90s and the opening up of Cold War records, we know he was guilty. There is no doubt today. Julius Rosenberg was indeed guilty of the crime. She may not have been. And that would be an absolute tragedy if it turned out we executed somebody who was innocent. But most people say whether or not she spied, she clearly knew her husband was doing at least some of this and didn't tell anybody. Maybe she shouldn't have died for that, but at the very least, So Klaus Fuchs was one thing. He was at least an immigrant who wasn't even a citizen at this point. These guys were native-born Americans. These were Americans. I mean, look at them. They could be your next-door neighbor. So the idea that the Rosenbergs could be a spy instilled the idea that anybody could be a spy. In the same way anybody could be an alien. And again, it's going back to those crazy movies from the 50s. A lot of the movies were about aliens disguising themselves as regular people. And that was very much part of the Cold War fear, that anybody, your son, your husband, your father, your mother, anybody could be a communist. There was another famous case, the Alger Hiss case, another American who worked for the U.S. State Department. The State Department is the department, the federal government, that deals with other countries. And they're the ones that's supposed to be spreading democracy and keeping countries from being communist. Well, this guy named Alger Hiss worked for them. And he was accused by a guy named Whittaker Chambers. Chambers was a communist in the 1930s as a young man. By the late 1940s, Whittaker Chambers is no longer a communist. In fact, he works for Time magazine as an editor. He was a very well-respected person. And Whittaker Chambers wrote an article. He said, I used to go to communist meetings back in the 30s. By the way, let me take a quick break. In the 1930s, a lot of Americans were kind of into communism for a brief period. Because, during the Great Depression, it did look like the American government wasn't working anymore. So there were a few people that thought this communist stuff might be a good idea. Almost all of them walked away from that during World War II. They all thought, well, that was dumb. We're not doing that. So Whittaker Chambers was one of those guys. And he said, but I think some of those people are still communists. And he said, this guy, Alger Hiss, I used to know him. He was a communist. And I think he is still a communist. And he is now working at a high level in the State Department. And if he is there, that means the State Department must be full of communists. So Whittaker Chambers is accusing the federal government of being full of communists. Well, Alger Hiss denied it. He says, I never was a communist. I never, ever was, and I'm not a communist. By the way, we know that Alger Hiss in 48, 49, 50 really wasn't a communist. There's no evidence he was a communist. However, Alger Hiss probably did go to communist meetings in the 1930s. It was not a smart move of his to have said that. By the way, there's no law against being a communist. Again, you're allowed to be a communist. We're a free country. But in the 40s and 50s, it kind of wasn't allowed. I mean, again, we kind of panicked. And if you even admitted you were a communist, you could be thrown in prison, which is un-American, but that's how we were for a brief period. So Alger Hiss denied it. And he actually sued Whittaker Chambers in court for defamation of character. And during that trial, Alger Hiss said, I had never, ever, ever been a communist, and I've never even been to a communist meeting. And during that trial, Whittaker Chambers produced records that proved Alger Hiss had at least gone to a communist meeting. So Alger Hiss lost his case. And the federal government then convicted Alger Hiss for perjury, which means lying under oath. And he actually went to prison for a while. So there's two things here. One is, along with the Rosenbergs, the Hiss trial started to make Americans very, very afraid of communism. That communists might be in our own government, although there was very little evidence that there were hardly any communists in the government. But because of Alger Hiss, there was a fear of them. But it also shows, on the flip side, Alger Hiss was technically really wasn't guilty of a crime other than lying that he had ever gone to a communist meeting. But again, there's no law against being a communist. So it does also show the levels of fear and panic that was in American society at this point. By the way, the politician who went after Alger Hiss was a senator named Richard Nixon, who, because he was so popular because of this, he would be picked by Dwight Eisenhower to be his vice president. And then he would run for president in 1960. He will lose, but he runs again in 1968 and he becomes president. And then he gets reelected in 72. And then, as some of you may know, he gets in trouble with something called Watergate, where he lied, ironically. But the Cold War created a lot of politicians. John F. Kennedy became a major politician because of the Cold War. Richard Nixon, and also a guy named Joseph McCarthy that we're going to talk about for just a moment. So in the early 50s, we get something that we sometimes call the Red Scare. The reason we fear communists, the reason we call communists Reds is because Karl Marx always said that it was the poor people of the world who do all the fighting and wars, and they do all the work for everybody else. In other words, it's the blood, the red blood of the working people that they should be celebrating, which is why communism always used red. Red China, red Russia. The flag's always red. That red is supposed to represent the blood of the working people, you know. So we often call the fear of communism the Red Scare. And in the early 50s, we had a Red Scare. And part of it was the fear of the spread of communism. And that was a legitimate fear. We should have been afraid of that. We also were afraid of the bomb. Again, that's a legitimate fear. We also were afraid of spies. And even though I made a point that Hiss really wasn't that big a deal, and even Ethel Rosenberg may not have been a spy, there really were spies. Like I said, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we used to say that, oh, this was totally an overreaction. We now know that even though there was overreaction, the fear was real. There was real spies. There were hundreds, if not thousands of spies in America. I mean, that was real. But I also have nonconformists listed here. Now, that's kind of a weird thing. Because today in America, we celebrate individuality. We all look different. We act different. We like being different from each other. And, you know, communism is about everybody being the same. But in America, in the early 50s, people thought, okay, who becomes communists? Only weird people become communists. People who are different, people who are odd. So nonconformity, meaning being different from everybody else, being an individual, meant that you might be a communist. So the irony is that this free country, a country of individuals, began to fear individuality. So if, say, you grew a beard like I have, that would have been considered very weird, and that might be a sign I'm a communist. Or you dress differently, you act differently. This is why people like Martin Luther King, Elvis Presley, even John F. Kennedy, people who had different opinions and acted differently, were often called communists. So, you know, it's kind of un-American in a way. The politician who rose to power more than anybody else because of communism was a senator named Joseph McCarthy. He was from Wisconsin. He was a relatively unknown politician. But he gave a speech in West Virginia where he accused the federal government of harboring communists, made him very, very famous. He was in Wheeling, West Virginia in 1950, and he was speaking to a women's club, and he said, in my hand here, I have the list of 108 known communists today working for the State Department. And part of that is the fact that it was such a specific number, 108. By the way, he would give that speech dozens of times. Every time he gave it, it was a different number. He never showed anybody the list. I mean, he had a piece of paper, but he never let anybody ever see it. And of course, he was making it up. I mean, later, he even admitted that he made all this up. But he was playing upon the fears of communism. And, in fact, the fear of communism became known as McCarthyism. In fact, McCarthy was very proud of this. It's kind of like Obamacare. You know, he was proud, although Obamacare is totally different from this. I didn't mean to imply this. But I mean, you know, Obama, the national, our healthcare system now is called Obamacare, and it was kind of meant as an insult, but Barack Obama kind of claims it now, kind of proudly. I call it Obamacare. McCarthy was proud of this. This was, because it made him popular, and he played upon these fears. And in Congress, he was given his own committee to begin investigating communists in the army and in the government. By the way, he never actually found any communists. There were real communists here in America, and there were other committees that really did find them. But McCarthy actually never convicted anybody. It was a total sham. It was like a witch hunt. He really had very little to go on. And he was, asked questions like, when did you first become a communist? Or how many communists do you know? He was just fishing. Eventually, he took on the U.S. Army, and he lost. Because Dwight D. Eisenhower was president by this point. And, Dwight Eisenhower was a general, and he was commander-in-chief, and he knew there were no communists in the army. So he made sure that McCarthy did this on TV. Because once he went on television, people realized how much of a bully McCarthy was. And the fact that McCarthy really didn't have any data, that he was just making all this up. And he was ruined. The American public hated him for it. And eventually he gets thrown out of Congress. And he died in 1956, an alcoholic. He was such an alcoholic, he used to walk around with a stick of butter that he would just eat on to coat his stomach because he had such bad ulcers. He's really a sad case. He could have been a very, very good politician. He might have gone on to be president. But because he played upon these fears and he did a lot of distasteful things, he ended up being a broken person and died because of it. But McCarthyism becomes synonymous, meaning the same, of fears, irrational fears. Again, as I try to point out, there were legitimate reasons to be afraid of communism. But we went way beyond normality. I mean, it really did become a panic. If you take a job, like my job, working for a state college in Georgia, I would have had to take a loyalty oath. And I would have to sign a document saying that I'm not a communist or a socialist or whatever. And of course, if you're really liberal, you'd be called a communist. If you were super, super conservative, you'd be called a fascist or a Nazi. There was a real sense that you couldn't say just whatever you felt like saying or have any political opinions. There really was a sense that you had to be, very careful what you said. And so in a way, as we are afraid of communism, we want to celebrate freedom, there was a brief period where we weren't very free. And thousands of people lost their jobs because they acted different or they had political opinions that other people didn't agree with. And a lot of lives were ruined because of McCarthyism. Not just because of Joseph McCarthy, but because of the fears. So it is kind of a dark period. We overreacted. And again, going back to this class, and I keep doing this, notice how often it goes back to fear. Segregation was fear. Our treatment of immigrants was fear. Some of our really ugly propaganda and the rounding up of Japanese Americans was fear. Fear, irrational fear. Fear with no evidence behind it is something we should be afraid of and need to be very careful with. That is a lesson we do learn from history. So why the Red Scare? Let's recap very quickly. There were real fears and dangers. I don't want to discount that. And I think I've tried to make that very clear. But there was also what we could call mass paranoia, mass panic, and overreaction. And again, a lot of this is pure politics. Nixon's doing this. McCarthy is doing this. There are Republicans accusing Democrats of being weak on communism. Once Republicans get the White House under Eisenhower, the Democrats will start accusing them of being weak on communism. So this is very much part of politics. So as always, politics, along with fear, politics always seems to play a role in this. And keep that in mind. When you listen to politicians today talk about stuff, do they really mean it? Or are they just trying to get in power? Kind of, whenever politicians start talking in huge anger, fear-like speeches, do they really mean it? Or is this just, is this just a way to get in power? And think back to times like this. One more thing, and then we'll end this part one. I was going to try to do this as one big lecture, but we're already over an hour. So I'm going to make this part one, and then we'll have part two next. Because I need to take a break too. So 1952, we're still in mass panic in the U.S. China's communist, Russia's communist. We all got the bomb. So we test the H bomb. The earlier bombs sometimes were called A bombs. A just means atomic. just referring to the atom. All nuclear bombs are actually atomic bombs. It means you either split an atom to unleash power, or you fuse two atoms together. So you have fission bombs, the division of atoms, or fusion bombs, but they still involve atoms and splitting up the nucleus of an atom, which is why we get the word nuclear. The nuclear and atom really mean the same thing. But the term A-bomb usually refers to these early bombs. And then we start using the term H-bomb, or sometimes nuclear bomb, to refer to these new ones. Those first few bombs, you used plutonium or uranium to do it. And they were, that worked pretty good. But then they came up with the idea of using hydrogen, which is where we get the term H-bomb from, which was much, much more powerful than A-bombs. These bombs were, again, massive. These were 800 to 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs we exploded in Japan. These are your doomsday bombs. And we exploded the first one in the Marshall Islands. Russia will have their own hydrogen bomb within 6 months. And they didn't steal it this time. They had caught up with us by that point. So 1952, we really are at a point where we can destroy the world, with the H-bomb. These are the doomsday bombs. These are the bombs that really can destroy an entire city where there are no survivors. This is A-bombs were bad, but you could survive it. In fact, there are people who lived in Hiroshima when it was bombed, survived it, and went to Nagasaki, and then it was bombed, and they survived that. There are actually people that survived 2 atomic bombings. In fact, the last one died about 3 years ago. There would be no survivors of these bombs. So the world just got even scarier. And again, good place to stop for part 1.